British voters are casting their vote in a defining general election today, a third in 4 years. They're facing a difficult choice involving two of their most unpopular leaders. Conservative Prime Minister Boris Johnson is sometimes referred to as a liar, and opposition Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn a dreamer. Many have already put a cross next to their preferred candidate. In the midst of a Brexit crisis, many have vented their frustrations at the situation they find themselves in.
Brexit. And are we going to stop?
I'm sort of sad we're here again, really. It feels like 5 minutes since we've done this, and if anything, we've gone backwards, not forwards. And it's an election that should have been dominated by Brexit and has to a certain extent, but locally at least we are deluged in the anti-Semitism row. And I think a lot of people are struggling to find parties that they identify with or that properly represent the full spectrum of their own views.
I was quite unsure on who to. I had an idea of who I wanted to vote for, but I think it was based. I think it was obviously based largely around Brexit and what the next steps were. So that was what I based my vote on.
I think the lies, the exaggeration, the lack of courtesy, the backslanging, the treating the public as stupid. I think more than anything, I have been shouting at radio and television for a year saying, do you think we're stupid?
Let's get more on this now. We crossed our correspondent in London, Holly Hudson. A very good afternoon to you, Holly. This election has been referred to by some as the most important general election in a generation. Why?
Well, as you say, it's been billed as historic because the country faces perhaps its biggest decision in terms of political direction for quite some time. As you mentioned in your introduction there, neither of these leaders are particularly popular. And in terms of the actual time of the election, this is the first winter election since 1923. So there's a lot of unknowns in terms of this choice that voters have today, not least the fact that, of course, it's the first election in over a century at this time of year. Will people turn out in the numbers that they usually do? We usually see around 68% of the country. Millions of voters are going to the polls today. They opened at 7 a.m. UK time. They'll close today at 10 p.m. and that's when we'll get more of an indication of exactly where the country could be heading in the years to come, not just in terms of Brexit, but in terms of its political direction. But as I said, a lot of unknowns here, not least the fact that this is the first election in almost 100 years at this time of year. Will that influence whether people come out to the polls? There's a lot of voter apathy as well. As we heard in those interviews with people in the UK, there are a lot of people sort of trying to choose between what they see as the lesser evil, shall we say, in terms of Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn. Have their messages landed as well? Boris Johnson trying to frame this as the Brexit election. Get Brexit done. We will get Brexit done by 31st of January. We have an oven-ready deal, as we've heard him say many a time, and that will mean that we will be able to leave the European Union and respect the result of the referendum. Jeremy Corbyn and the main opposition Labour Party, they will initiate a second referendum. So a lot of voters still polarised on the Brexit issue, but how much will that land? Will the NHS, taxes, living standards, austerity overtake in terms of issues that actually matter to voters? Of course, we have to remember that this was a huge gamble that Boris Johnson made in calling this election in order to get that majority that he needs. Will it pay off?
Holly, we know that you've spoken quite a lot about how much unknowns there are and how many factors are at play. We also know that before a big election like this, there are always polls that try and point out how voters are going to turn out and how those voters are going to vote. Give us a sense of what's happening in the UK in terms of that polling.
Yeah, in terms of the polls, they have fluctuated, but the narrative has pretty much stayed the same. The Conservatives have maintained a lead over the main opposition party, Labour, Boris Johnson's Conservative Party, and that has reached as high as 14 points. But Labour are gaining in the latest polls that we've seen this week, whether that's down to a sort of series of gaffes that we've seen on behalf of Boris Johnson. There was a picture shown to him on a phone earlier this week of a 4-year-old boy on a floor of a hospital up in Leeds in the north of England. And the NHS, of course, quite a sensitive issue for the Conservatives. That is the message that Labour have been pushing. They would like to, that is sort of their main message really, and any sort of win on the NHS is a win for Labour. Boris Johnson was showing that picture, pocketed the phone, and he was very much criticised for his reaction on that. But that's not to say that Labour haven't suffered their own issues as well. The Shadow Health Secretary was this week heard describing their election campaign as dire outside of urban areas. Jeremy Corbyn dismissed that as banter between old friends, as did John Ashworth. But there's several key moments, I suppose, that could actually fluctuate, could influence the vote today and sort of tip the balance, really. Of course, the London Bridge terror attack as well a couple of weeks ago. Jack Merritt, the victim, his father has spoken out and criticised Boris Johnson directly for using that attack to as a sort of political football, as he describes it, capitalising on that issue in order to use it for the election. Jeremy Corbyn as well was criticised by the chief rabbi here, of course, for not tackling anti-Semitism in the right way. The chief rabbi Ephraim Mervis said that there was a poison that had taken root in Labour. Jeremy Corbyn, of course, retaliated, saying that racism in all forms is not acceptable in the Labour Party, and they have investigated all cases. So there's several issues that really could sway things here. What will be crucial will be these marginal seats, these really tightly held seats by Labour that voted Brexit. That's where Boris Johnson and the Conservatives have been concentrating their efforts, what's known as the Red Wall, which is sort of in the north of England and across Wales, where Labour do hold seats, but that voted Leave in the referendum. So that is where Boris Johnson and the Conservatives have been concentrating their efforts. It remains to be seen exactly whether the Red Wall will fall, will be penetrated, and we'll know that later on tonight.
Holly Hudson giving us an update from London on those elections taking place. We're going to be following that story the whole day on SABC News and keeping you updated.